Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to be doing a quick little watercolor demo on how to paint a feather using watercolors. So right now I'm just getting my paints activated and hydrated so that they are ready to roll when I start painting. The main colors I'll be using for this painting are gamboge, which is this kind of warm yellow color, and then quinacridone red, which is a very pink red, and then cadmium red, which is a very orange-based red. Those are the main colors. I'll also be using ultramarine a little bit later. And then I'm just taking a number 2 pencil and sketching out my feather. Now I'm using a really light hand. I'm not pushing hard or indenting my paper with this. And when I erase, I am using a very gentle hand as I erase. If you are new to drawing, I would recommend drawing this out on a scrap piece of paper. You can follow along on the drawing guide I provided in the corner, and then transfer it to your watercolor paper using a light box, carbon paper, or you can just take your pencil and color it on the back side of the scrap piece of paper you drew on, and then put that down on your watercolor paper and then trace over it. Just because if you draw on your watercolor paper and you push really hard or you erase really hard, and you do that a lot of times, it will damage your paper and it can lead to frustration further down the road. So now I am wetting my feather, and I am just making sure that water is staying in the lines of that feather, and then I'm going to go in with my gamboge and start kind of applying that yellow paint. Now the reason why I only wet the paper where the feather is because the paint will flow wherever I pre-wet that paper. And so if I got a lot of water outside of the lines of that feather, that yellow paint would flow into those areas. So when you're learning how to paint with watercolor, one of the things people struggle with the most is control. And one of the things to keep in mind is your paint will only flow where the paper's wet. So if you don't want your paint to go somewhere, keep it nice and dry. Now that I have the yellow added to the painting, I am going in with my quinacridone red, which is my more pink or cool based red. And I am just starting to add my brush strokes. I'm making sure that they follow the shape of the feather. I did do a long brush stroke kind of in an S curve that follows, I guess, the quill shaft or the quill part of the feather. But then the rest of them are branching out and they are kind of following the direction of my drawing. And that's going to help give our feather shape, because if I just drew those sections of the feather going straight out horizontally, our feather wouldn't look right. So when you are drawing fur or hair or feathers, you want to make sure you're looking at your reference and looking at what direction everything is laying and making your brush strokes match that. And now I'm just going to do the same process on the left side of this feather. You'll notice that I didn't cover up all of the yellow or even all of the white of the paper. And that's because watercolors are transparent. You don't want to cover up all of your highlights with a dark paint because you can't get those highlights back very easily. So you tend to work light to dark and you try to preserve your highlights as much as you can. And then as you work, and if you need to darken up some areas, then you can, but you want to be a little bit cautious at the beginning. So I'm leaving some of that yellow peeking through, some of the white peeking through, and then as I go along, I'll fill it in as needed. Now I'm going back in with a little bit more yellow, just reinforcing areas where I want that yellow to be a little bit more saturated. And that's just something to keep in mind, is when you are painting, color and value are relative to what is next to it. So if you've ever painted something and you've used pure white paint straight from the tube and it's not standing out and you're like, man, I need to have a whiter paint than what I have, that's because the colors next to it are too bright. And so you need to darken them up, darken their value just a little bit, and then that bright highlight will stand out. Same with if you are using black straight from the tube and it's not dark enough, that means the values of the color of the values next to that black paint, or where you want that really dark shadow to be, need to be lightened up just a smidge. You might mix a blue paint and think, man, this is a beautiful, just true blue color, and then you put it next to another color and then it might read a green blue and it might not look quite right. and that's because the color is interacting visually with what's next to it. There's always room to tweak and adjust, and that's why I like to work in layers. And now you can see I'm coming in with some more red paint, and I'm starting to do more fine lines and details with this feather. And I'm going back between the reds and the yellows and making oranges and just starting to get more of those finer details. I'm using a smaller paintbrush for this, and I'm making sure my brush strokes, again, are matching the direction of the feathers coming out from the quill, or that hard. And I'm just using a smaller paintbrush as I go along. The more layers and details I'm adding, if I feel like I need a little bit more control, then I move down to a smaller paintbrush as I go along. These are just round paintbrushes. They're the most common paintbrush used with watercolor, and they're really diverse. You just want to look for one that has a nice fine point, because then you can do more with your paintbrush that way. I'm just getting a little bit more of my cadmium red. Cadmium red is a little bit more opaque and not as transparent as my quinacridone red, and it's a little bit more closer to orange on the color wheel. And what I'm doing is I'm using it to really help get some more of those shadow areas in on my feather. And for the most part, I am concentrating it towards the center of the feather by the quill, or that hard center shaft that's in a feather. And then I am making my brush strokes go outward from there. And that way they have a little bit more of a finer point and getting more delicate towards the edge, like you would see with a real feather. If you are having a hard time having control and having gentle brush strokes with this, feel free to move and twist your board around so that you are pulling it towards you or away from you, whatever is easier for you to get those delicate brush strokes. Don't be afraid to, move your paper or your board around so that you can have an easier time with painting. Sometimes we kind of get stuck and feel like we have to have it in this one position, but that's not the case. And I just want to thank you guys for putting up with my super breathy voice at the moment. I am 9 months pregnant, and I have a baby pushing on my lungs, and it makes me out of breath very, very easily. And so I apologize if I sound really out of breath while doing this voiceover. I promise I didn't run a mile or two before doing the voiceover. I'm just super pregnant. But now I've taken my ultramarine blue, and I am starting to add a little bit of a shadow to the left side of the feather. And that ultramarine blue was mostly water with just a little bit of blue paint. It's a very, very pale blue because I want to gradually build up this shadow. So you can see you can just barely see it on the screen right now. And then I'll go through and darken it up. I also added a little bit of that blue to the left side of that center quill on the feather, just to help give that center section dimension. And then I'm doing another layer of blue on the shadow area on the left side, added a little bit more blue to that mix, so it's a little bit darker, but it's still very diluted, and I'm just building up the layers. And I'm making sure my brush strokes match the shape of the feather and even the shape of the clumps of the feather. So if there are sections of the feather that kind of are separated more, or they're a little bit longer, I'm trying to make that shadow area match it. Now, to help dilute the shadow and make it look a little bit more gradual, I did take some clear water, and I just ran it right along the edge of where I had painted, and that kind of helped that blue paint diffuse and kind of spread out. And then I took a little bit of my quinacridone red, added that to a little bit of the blue to make a violet, and I am adding that to the shadow as well to just help darken it. There's not a ton of color mixing with this feather. It is a very beginner-friendly painting, but when you mix a red and a blue together, you will get a purple or a violet. So that is what I'm using for my main shadow area. If I had used my more orange red, it wouldn't have been as vibrant of a violet. It would have been a little bit more muddy of a color, but I wanted it to be a little bit more vibrant. And you can see I took that ultramarine blue mix and then added a lot of quinacridone red to it to make kind of a red-violet color. And I'm using that red-violet to act as more of the strong shadows on the feather itself. So we have all these red tones on the feather, and to help give it a little bit more dimension, give it a little more depth, and to help things read as being in the shadows, I'm doing a red-violet. Usually, the more in shadow something is, it tends to appear a little bit more blue in color or cooler toned. And so by doing a really cool toned blue-red, it's just going to help it read as being more in a shadow. Now earlier we talked about wet into wet layers, where we pre-wet the paper and we added the color, and that allowed the color to really flow and blend together on the paper. Now as you go through and you are adding details to your picture, you want to let each layer of paint dry before you add another layer. So that's why I went and worked on the shadow areas, and for the most part let the rest of the feather dry completely. And that's so I could come back in and add more of these shadows and more of these layers of paint without disrupting the layers of color underneath it. That's one of the things that frustrates people with working with watercolor the most, is that they'll go and add a layer of paint over the top, and all those layers of paint that they worked so hard to get beautiful beforehand lift off, and now they're left with this weird white spot, and that's because there's too much water and the paint wasn't allowed to dry. So when you're adding details and you want to have lots of control in your picture, you want to let that paper dry completely before each layer, and you tend to use less and less water as you go along. So make sure you don't have any water droplets on the barrel of your brush that are going to roll down and create a puddle, because those can be a little bit hard to cover. And make sure your paper dries completely. If you are having a hard time waiting for your paper to dry completely, you can use something like a heat tool or even a blow dryer to dry that paper in between each layer. Just make sure, especially if you're using a blow dryer, it tends to push the air a lot. So hold it farther back and make sure you don't have any puddles on your paper, or else your paint will get blown around. And as you can tell, where we put the shadow on the left side, that means the light source is coming from the right side. That also means that on the feather itself, I'm making the left side of the feather be a little bit deeper in value than the right side. There's a little bit more highlights on the right side, a little bit more shadow on the left side. So just something to keep in mind. When you are working from a reference photo, that is one of the benefits, is you can see where the shadows and the highlights are, and that will help give whatever you're painting more dimension and depth. And when you're almost done with a picture like we are here, I really recommend taking a break, or if you're feeling really frustrated and you don't know what to do next to fix your picture, take a break and then come look at it with fresh eyes, because it makes it so you can better gauge where you need to tweak or adjust your painting. Working on a painting frustrated has never helped anyone. And there's been times where I thought I was done with the picture, and then I came back at it with fresh eyes and I was like, oh, there's still a lot more I need to do. But now I'm mixing up a neutral blue color. And how I made that neutral blue color was I added some red and yellow to it. Red and yellow make orange, and orange is the opposite of blue. And so by adding orange to my blue, it made it appear a little bit more gray or desaturated in color. And now I'm using that for the shadow area on my feather. And then anywhere that I feel like that shadow is too strong or too harsh of a line, I'm taking clean, clear water and just running it right along the edge of where I painted. And that allows that paint to flow to that new wet area of the paper. You have to make sure your paint doesn't dry completely before you do that, or it won't flow as well. And then I'm taking that same color and I'm just using it to strengthen up where I want those shadows to be strongest, right along the left side of the feather and on the cast shadow. And then just adding a little bit more red to just add a few details. I'm also kind of going back and forth and softening up some of the lines where I want them to blend a little bit more softly. And now it's just time to sign the picture. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you would like to see more watercolor and soft pastel tutorials and demos and product reviews, please hit the follow button. And I'll see you next time. Bye.